USS Thresher was the lead submarine of her class of nuclear-powered attack boats in the early 1960s. Named for the Thresher shark, she carried state-of-the-art features that made her among the fastest and quietest submarines of her day, and significantly pushed the boundaries of Cold War technology. But in April 1963, Thresher left port to perform a series of test dives off Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and never returned. The second USS Thresher, SSN 593, was one of the first submarines to use a teardrop hull. Unlike conventionally powered boats, nuclear submarines could remain submerged for long periods because they did not need to surface for propulsion. Thresher measured about 278 feet in length, displaced roughly 4,369 tons submerged, and could make more than 30 knots underwater. She was launched on July 9, 1960, and commissioned on August 3, 1961. From 1960 to 1961, Commander Dean Lexine led the boat and her crew through a long program of trials in the Western Atlantic and the Caribbean, during which the crew evaluated the submarine's complex systems and weapons through exercises that included a 3-week training course in San Juan, Puerto Rico, sonar and weapons tests, anti-submarine warfare exercises with Task Group Alpha, and missile-related trials off Charleston. After extended testing and recertification, Thresher undocked on April 8, 1963, and the next day departed from Maine for dive tests in deep water east of Cape Cod. A little over a day later, while the submarine was approaching test depth, the rescue ship USS Skylark received a garbled underwater telephone transmission in which a voice reported minor difficulties and said they were attempting to blow. Minutes later, received an even more unintelligible message that included the number 900, and sonar operators heard a rushing noise like escaping air. Those were the last sounds heard from Thresher. By that afternoon, 15 Navy ships were en route to the area, and by 6:30 p.m., family members had been told Thresher was missing at sea. The following day, Navy leaders concluded there was no hope, and the submarine and her 129-person complement of listed sailors, officers, and civilian contractors were declared lost. President John F. Kennedy was notified and ordered flags to be flown at half-staff for 4 days. Thresher's loss remains the second deadliest submarine disaster on record. 14 months later, the wreck was located. Investigators found Thresher broken into several major sections with a debris field covering almost 33 acres of seafloor. A court of inquiry examined photographs, recovered artifacts, and the submarine's design and short service history, and concluded that a failure in the saltwater piping system, particularly a joint that had been silver-brazed rather than welded, likely initiated a leak that led to electrical shorts and loss of power. Despite the court's findings, the Navy kept most of the investigation classified and released only a small portion of the material for decades, saying secrecy was necessary to protect serving submarine crews, and the restricted nature of the records fueled theories and suspicion through the Cold War era. In 2019, Captain James Bryant, a retired submariner who had commanded Thresher-class boats and long questioned the classified handling of the incident, sued the Navy under the Freedom of Information Act. In February 2020, a federal court ordered the release of thousands of pages, and the Navy began publishing documents in batches. Declassifications finalized in 2021 confirmed that Thresher's loss resulted from a chain of failures. The boat had been pressed into service with an inadequately trained crew. Systems and procedures were still maturing amid Cold War pressure to field faster and deeper diving submarines, and workmanship problems, especially inadequate welding and brazing in piping, led to a ruptured pipe, flooding, electrical failures, and a subsequent inability to stop the flooding or restore propulsion and buoyancy. Facing uncontrolled flooding and loss of power, Thresher is believed to have descended until she imploded at great depth. The collapse would have occurred in a fraction of a second. The document's release has allowed submarine safety experts and instructors to study the mistakes openly, and Thresher's loss directly prompted the Navy to institute a rigorous design review and safety inspection program introduced later in 1963. From 1915 to 1963, the Navy lost 16 submarines to non-combat accidents. And after SubSafe's implementation, only one submarine not certified under the program suffered a similar fate. Navy leaders have said the changes born from the Thresher tragedy fundamentally altered design, construction, inspection, testing, and safety practices, and have made the submarine force far safer. Thresher was never formally decommissioned and remains on eternal patrol on the ocean floor, while the Navy continues to monitor the wreck site and its environmental condition. As of the latest releases, her nuclear fuel remains intact. The lessons learned from the catastrophe reshaped submarine safety, and likely saved countless lives in the decades that followed. In May 1968, the USS Scorpion, another nuclear-powered attack submarine, disappeared while on patrol in the Mediterranean after a final message indicated she was closing on a Soviet vessel and she failed to return to Norfolk, Virginia. The crew was never heard from again, and a massive search was launched. Subsequent investigations revealed a series of mishandlings by the Navy, including a possible cover-up and a rushed overhaul procedure that may have cost nearly 100 sailors their lives. Dan Rogers, an electrician's mate aboard Scorpion, requested a transfer and tried to warn others, later saying he felt deeply uneasy after what he had seen. His transfer ultimately saved his life, but many of his shipmates were not so fortunate. USS Scorpion was a skipjack-class nuclear-powered attack submarine, whose teardrop hull allowed submerged speeds up to about 34 knots, roughly 38 miles per hour. Built by General Dynamics Electric Boat, her keel was laid on August 20, 1958, in Groton, Connecticut. She was launched on December 19, 1959, and commissioned about 6 months later. Assigned to Submarine Squadron 6, Division 62, Scorpion deployed to Europe for 2 months to operate with the 6th Fleet and NATO navies, then returned to the U.S. East Coast for training before moving to Norfolk, Virginia, where she earned a Navy unit commendation. Norfolk became her home port and she specialized in nuclear submarine warfare tactics, participating in exercises across the Atlantic, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico. From mid-1963 into May 1964, she remained at Charleston for an overhaul. After resuming duties in late spring, her schedule was interrupted for a 2-month transatlantic patrol, and she later conducted a similar patrol in European waters in 1966. Her commanding officer, Norman Bessich, received a Navy Commendation Medal for leadership, and other officers and crew were cited for meritorious service. It is said that in 1966, Scorpion entered an inland Russian sea during a northern run, and filmed a Soviet missile launch through her periscope before withdrawing. As part of the SubSafe safety program introduced after Thresher's loss, Scorpion underwent routine tests intended to certify hull integrity and systems. In February 1967, she entered Norfolk Naval Shipyard, but, amid intense operational demands, received only emergency repairs rather than a full overhaul, while SubSafe had lengthened overhaul schedules. The Chief of Naval Operations authorized an experimental accelerated procedure that bypassed some safety checks and installations. Repair crews were overworked and relied on jury-rigged spare parts. Many repairs involved poorly welded pipes, and Scorpion was restricted to a shallow diving limit of about 110 meters. She returned to service after roughly 7 months, but was not awarded SubSafe certification, one of only 4 Atlantic Fleet submarines to fail that standard. After refresher training and weapon tests in late 1967, Scorpion sailed for the Mediterranean under a new commanding officer, Francis Slattery, and in February 1968 transited to the naval base at Rota, Spain. The boat's poor condition forced a crewman to leave, and letters from sailors described severe mechanical problems: propeller shaft leaks, hydraulic oil leaks, freon leaks, unstable control surfaces, and even an electrical fire near the trash disposal unit. Despite these faults, Scorpion departed Rota-bound for the Azores to surveil Soviet ships and hoped to return to Norfolk. At midnight on May 21, Slattery transmitted a confirmation that they had located a Soviet submarine. The message was received by a Navy communications station in Greece and forwarded to Commander, Submarine Force Atlantic, indicating Scorpion was closing on the target at about 15 knots and 110 meters depth and would begin surveillance. Scorpion was overdue in Norfolk 6 days later, and that message proved to be the last contact. The Navy launched an intensive search using optimized statistical search patterns. Recordings from a station in the Canary Islands captured 15 acoustic events over 190 seconds that sounded like an underwater explosion. On June 5, Scorpion and her 99-person crew were declared presumed lost, and her name was stricken from the Naval Register. Some later reports suggested the Navy conducted secret search activity before the public search began. But it took months to locate the wreck. In late October, the oceanographic vessel, USS Thresher, found Scorpion's remains about 460 miles southwest of the Azores using a towed camera sled. The 77-meter hull lay on the seabed at roughly 3,000 meters depth, having plowed a trench in the seafloor with the sail torn off. The operations center collapsed inward, and one running light open as if deployed or dislodged by the shock. A 1969 secondary investigation, using extensive photographs, video, and eyewitness testimony, concluded the hull had imploded under hydrostatic pressure and the vessel broke into sections. The torpedo room was largely intact except for a missing hatch in the forward escape trunk, while the engineering section collapsed and the propulsion shaft parted. A court of inquiry reported in January 1969 that the precise cause could not be ascertained from available evidence. Theories proliferated. Vice Admiral Arnold Red Shade and former Scorpion mechanic Don Rogers argued a faulty trash disposal unit could have admitted seawater into the batteries, producing hydrogen that incapacitated the crew and led to an internal explosion. Others pointed to a hydrogen explosion caused by charging batteries at periscope depth, or to a catastrophic torpedo malfunction. Some books and authors advanced more sinister scenarios, including possible attack by a Soviet submarine or a torpedo fired from a helicopter. But those claims relied heavily on conjecture and anonymous sources. Decades later, declassified material and internal Navy analysis suggested a defective Mark 37 torpedo warhead may have detonated. These weapons used silver zinc batteries prone to overheating and even combustion, leading some investigators and authors, including those of Blindman's Bluff, to propose that a hot-running torpedo battery started a fire that detonated the weapon and ruptured the hull. Don Rogers, who left Scorpion months earlier because he judged her unsafe, and investigative reporters uncovered documents and crew letters that corroborated the vessel's degraded condition. Authors Christopher Drew and Sherry Santag have argued that the Navy ignored prior warnings and problems regarding the boat's readiness, while investigators could not fully confirm that the torpedoes caused the explosion. They warned the danger was plausible. To this day, the exact reasons behind the sinking of USS Scorpion have not been conclusively determined, but the U.S. Navy never again rushed overhaul procedures after the loss, revised the Mark 37 torpedo design, and routinely surveys the wreck for radioactive leakage. In early 1968, the Soviet nuclear ballistic missile submarine, K-129, abruptly went missing near American waters off Hawaii. The Soviets could not locate their powerful vessel, but the U.S. Navy did, and with CIA cooperation and assistance from billionaire Howard Hughes launched Project Azorian to salvage the wreck, one of the most impressive naval engineering feats of the era. Many experts concluded the Soviet submarine apparently sank while attempting to launch a nuclear strike, an action that would have dramatically changed history. In 1968, Cold War tensions were high. The Vietnam War continued. Domestic unrest followed Martin Luther King's assassination, and Soviet naval patrols monitored American operations. K-129, a Project 629 diesel-electric ballistic missile submarine of the Pacific Fleet, based at Kamchatka, had been laid down in May 1958, modified in 1964, and re-entered service in 1967. She was reported to carry a D-4 launch system with 3 SSN-5 Serb missiles, each with a range of over 1,670 kilometers and a roughly 1 megaton warhead, and was manned by nearly 100 experienced sailors. K-129 departed on her third patrol on February 24, 1968, was expected back by May 5. and after initial test dives and radio checks, proceeded toward the 180th meridian and the patrol area. She radioed headquarters and then disappeared. The Soviets mounted a search, but found nothing. U.S. intelligence, noting Soviet search activity, reviewed SOSUS acoustic records, and detected an underwater event near Hawaii. The submarine USS Halibut was tasked with locating the wreck, and after months of searching, found the debris field in August 1968, roughly 2,500 kilometers from Hawaii, at about 4,900 meters depth. Photographing the site to assess its condition, U.S. planners decided to try to recover a missile or intelligence materials. CIA engineers concluded the only feasible method was to use a massive mechanical claw and a heavy hydraulic system. Mounted on a surface ship, the CIA engaged Howard Hughes and built the Glomar. Explorer, ostensibly a manganese nodule recovery ship fitted with a moonpool, derrick-like structures, a giant capture vehicle, and other specialized gear. The Glomar sailed in June 1974. During the lift, the wreck broke apart. One section fell back to the depths, while the capture device recovered another. The CIA recovered 2 of the 3 nuclear missiles and the remains of 6 Soviet sailors, but not the missing device. Leaks and a Los Angeles Times expose in early 1975 forced cancellation of a follow-up recovery. And the CIA maintained a policy of neither confirming nor denying the operation for years. In 1992, CIA Director Robert Gates released declassified footage of the burial at sea of the recovered sailors, and over time, some recovered materials were returned to Russia. Yet many Russian officers remained skeptical, and theories about Project Azorian persisted, most dramatically that K-129 sank while attempting a launch that might have triggered a global crisis. The full story remains incomplete. Both the CIA and Russian archives still hold classified material about K-129 and the salvage, and the exact fate and location of the missing nuclear device remain unknown. They believed they did not need escorts to carry out their dangerous missions. However, once the Soviet Union fell in 1991, the legendary fleet began to wither, although some vessels continued to serve under different flags after being sold. Others, like the Kiev-class carrier Minsk, suffered a very different fate, eventually becoming a theme park attraction in China. To this day, the Russian Navy has only one carrier-type vessel, the heavy aircraft cruiser Admiral Kuznetsov. But during Soviet times, several heavy aircraft cruisers sailed the oceans and posed a serious challenge to NATO naval forces. These Soviet cruisers differed significantly from their American counterparts. While U.S. carriers operate as floating air bases protected by escort groups, Soviet heavy aircraft cruisers were heavily armed and designed to conduct missions independently. The Kiev ship, Project 1143, was the Soviet Navy's first class built to combine fixed-wing aircraft operations with battlecruiser characteristics. Only 4 were produced. The design featured a large island superstructure to starboard, a bow profile resembling a battlecruiser, and a relatively small angled flight deck. Rather than being called simple carriers like the American ships, Soviet sailors referred to them as heavy aircraft cruisers. Their roles included strategic missile and submarine support, and they were capable of anti-air, anti-submarine, and surface warfare. Minsk, named after the capital of Belarus, was laid down in 1972, launched in 1975, and completed in 1978. Fitted to Soviet standards, she carried launchers for 8 P-500 Basalt anti-ship cruise missiles, twin 76mm gun turrets, and other weapons. Minsk initially served with the Soviet Pacific Fleet and had a relatively uneventful service life during the final years of the Cold War, as did sister ships Kiev and Novorossiysk. A 4th, Kiev-class carrier, Baku, was also commissioned in 1979 and later served in various theaters including the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean. In 1984, Minsk, alongside Ivan Rovov-class landing ship Alexander Nikolaev and North Vietnamese forces, took part in an amphibious landing, the first such operation conducted by the Soviet Navy in that conflict. When the Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991, the Russian Navy inherited all 4 Kiev-class ships, but they proved costly and difficult to maintain. Minsk had been placed in reserve years earlier after a fire and severe engineering problems, and the shipyards able to perform major repairs were now in an independent Ukraine, leaving limited options for rehabilitation. It was decided that Minsk and Novorossiysk would be sold for scrap. Both were sent to South Korea in 1995, while Baku was eventually sold to India and, after extensive renovation, re-entered service under a new name. Environmental protests in South Korea in 1997 interrupted scrapping plans for Minsk, and she was instead resold to a Chinese investment company for about $4.3 million, roughly $7.30 million in today's currency, with the intention of turning her into the centerpiece of a military theme park. Minsk World opened in Shenzhen, Guangdong Province, in 2000. The ship was repainted with hull number 15 to match China's Type 001 carrier, Liaoning, and her berths, sleeping quarters, and armament were arranged as exhibits. Park staff wore mock military uniforms, staged musical performances on the flight and hangar decks, and offered VIP boat tours along the starboard side. The land area displayed a mix of aircraft MiG-23s, MiG-27s, Mi-24s, and various other planes and mock-ups, many of uncertain origin, likely acquired through post-Cold War surplus markets. Rumors circulated that the purchase had covert military aims, but the ship remained a public attraction for a time and even faced competition from another park that displayed Kiev, Minsk's sister ship. After a sharp decline in visitors in the mid-2000s, the operating company went bankrupt, and the Chinese government reclaimed the land. Minsk was auctioned in 2006 and changed hands several times, reopening briefly under a different operator before closing again. In January 2013, the carrier was sold to a real estate group, and by 2017 to 2018, she had been moved to a man-made lagoon off the Yangtze River in eastern China, where she sits abandoned amid agricultural land and a derelict viewing platform. Despite intermittent plans to restore the vessel or repurpose her as part of a theme park or hotel project, nothing permanent has materialized. The ship remains largely unsecured and decaying, with aircraft exhibits rotting inside and urban explorers visiting the site. The longer she languishes, the more likely her final destination will be the scrap. During the height of the Cold War, Soviet submarine engineering had been honed to produce robust, fast boats that could take heavy damage and dive deeper than many Western designs. U.S. submarines, by contrast, emphasized stealth over speed and firepower. Their quieter, ambush-capable designs could theoretically defeat noisier Soviet submarines before those advantages came into play. That belief was shaken in the mid-1980s when the Soviet Navy introduced the Akula-class nuclear-powered attack submarines. The breakthrough technology produced boats that were fast, lethal, resilient, and unexpectedly quiet, which caused a major reassessment in the West and made the U.S. Navy take the Akula-class very seriously. The Akula-class submarine was developed to address the strengths and weaknesses of the earlier Sierra-class boats. Sierra boats had titanium hulls that allowed deeper diving beyond about 1,800 feet, improved resilience to damage, up to 4 530mm torpedo tubes, and speeds approaching 34 knots. But their titanium construction was expensive and the boats were noisier than Western submarines, making them easier to detect. In response, Soviet designers began work in the mid-1970s on a new design that kept Sierra-like advantages while adopting quieter technology and a steel hull that was cheaper and easier to mass. Roughly 15 Akula-type boats were built, and after the first handful whose noise levels remained relatively high, later units received major quieting changes, including a lengthened hull, improved propellers acquired from foreign suppliers, and better vibration isolation, informed in part by espionage that revealed how Western systems detected submarines. Akulas used a double-hull layout for survivability, were powered by a pressurized nuclear reactor driving steam turbines and a multi-bladed fixed-pitch propeller, and could stay submerged for months, limited mainly by supplies and maintenance endurance. Figures of around 100 days are commonly cited. Later variants incorporated anechoic tiles, upgraded isolation for the powertrain, shock mounting across compartments, and low-noise propellers that cut cavitation, and brought acoustic signatures down to parity with contemporary Western boats, while retaining heavy armament, typically 8 forward tubes for 533mm and 4 650mm plus torpedoes, anti-ship missiles, and air defense systems. The combination of stealth, speed, and firepower transformed Western assessments of Soviet undersea capability and made Akula boats a serious threat on covert patrols and submarine tracking missions. After the Soviet collapse, the Russian Navy continued to operate upgraded Akulas into the 21st century, and some were leased for training abroad, though maintenance issues have occasionally been reported. At the other extreme, the Typhoon-class Project 941 represented a separate Soviet strategic approach, conceived to carry a very large SLBM load and to remain at sea through an extended nuclear crisis. Typhoon boats measured about 175 meters long, displaced on the order of 48,000 tons submerged, making them the largest submarines ever built, and were designed for long endurance. Figures around 120 days are often cited, providing a sea-based strategic deterrent comparable to American Ohio-class. SSBNS. Part 2, continue *.